I'm Richard Dolan, and this is False Flags. If you are someone who cares about the world you live in and are interested in that elusive thing called the truth, if you're interested in true personal transformation through the truth, then maybe this is the show for you. Our world is filled with violence, bombings, acts of terror, trauma. In watching or reading the news, we almost start to think this is the normal way things are supposed to be. What I think happens is that people watch the news, say CNN, Fox, or NBC, and they get to a point where they can't take it anymore. And then they just tune out. It's too confusing, too violent, too negative. You start to wonder, why put that into my life? Tuning out from the political is part of a larger symptom, the spread of a sense of hopelessness. Many people can feel this, even if they can't always see it or put it into words. It's a loss of control, a sense that the vehicle you thought you were driving is actually being driven by someone else. It comes with this sense of confusion about the world, in which the politics around us don't seem to make any sense. And there doesn't seem to be any way out. But what I am suggesting to you is that this is by design. The confusion, the hopelessness, it's not an accident. Maybe once, long ago, we might have believed that the political establishment was working for the people. Corrupt, sure, but more or less something that worked on behalf of the public. It's what our society still tells us every day, that ever so slowly we're moving toward greater inclusion, greater democracy, right? Well, maybe not. The confusion and hopelessness are no accident, and there is a reason for this. So this is a series on false flags and covert operations. Two questions probably come to mind. First, what's a false flag? And secondly, how do false flags and covert ops relate to what I've just been talking about? Well, let's talk about false flags and what they are. Most basically, a false flag is an action done by a person or usually a group, say a government or an intelligence agency, that's then blamed on someone else, like, terrorists, which is then used to justify things that could not otherwise be justified, like passing authoritarian laws or justifying military invasions and financial takeovers of nations, like Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Ukraine, or Syria. It can even be used for something as straightforward as diplomatic pressure and propaganda victories. For instance, we now know that America's CIA has the ability to conduct cyber attacks and leave phony cyber fingerprints that would implicate another nation. Pretty slick. Undoubtedly, there are other nations with similar capabilities. False flags are a genuine phenomenon. They are real. Sometimes people will try to tell you that false flags are tinfoil hat territory, but in fact, as you will see in this series, there have been many verified false flags. Now we turn to the pirates. It's from these fellows of history that we actually get the phrase false flag. The term itself goes back to early maritime history, particularly when pirates would use the flags of other countries to lure commercial vessels. Then when the prey got close enough, the pirates would hoist their black flag, board the ship, and steal its valuables. Professional historians tell us false flags were not uncommon during the golden age of piracy, the 17th and 18th centuries. You would think that from a group of people whose activities are the cause of the phrase false flag, that we would have many false flag stories from them. But in fact, we have only a small handful of specific examples of pirate false flags. Well, it turns out that the pirates in those days had more honor than the agencies of today that do false flags. At least when the pirates stole your treasure, you knew it was them. Today's perpetrators of false flags certainly don't make it so easy to pinpoint them. This program will be discussing the history of false flags, looking at the phenomenon in its early history, then really spending time on the 20th and 21st centuries. We'll be examining how false flags went from almost laughably simplistic in their earliest incarnation to the development and impact of the false flags that led to the Second World War, like the German Reichstag fire and invasion of Poland, and the Japanese false flags against China in the 1930s, and several interesting Soviet false flags. We'll also take a special look at the attack on Pearl Harbor and seek to understand to what extent that attack was desired and enabled by certain elites within the United States. Then we move into the Cold War, and finally, the 21st century. We'll see how and why the United States became, and still is, the world's leader in false flags. How false flags have become increasingly directed against domestic populations, whether through the FBI's COINTELPRO of the 1950s and 60s, the infamous Operation Gladio, the infamous Chinese Cultural Revolution, or the creation of patsies by intelligence agencies in our own era.
Come on, man. No, they're taking me in because of the fact that I lived in the Soviet Union. I'm just a patsy.
We'll also see how false flags continue to be used internationally to justify regime change, to destroy democratic governments, and even enable military invasions. From the operations in the Middle East and Central America in the 1950s and 60s to the wars and new Cold Wars of the 21st century. There is a real art in eliminating undesirable governments based on fake evidence and smear campaigns. Of course, we will be looking at 9/11, still the most important false flag of our lifetime.
On September the 11th, enemies of freedom committed an act of war against our country. Our war on terror begins with Al-Qaeda, but it does not end there.
The justification for the U.S. war on terror and the abrogation of civil liberties, not merely in the United States, but mimicked in other nations around the world. 9/11 transformed the world, and it was, without any shadow of a doubt, perpetrated upon us as a grand deception. Now, as we're headed toward 2 decades of post-9/11 dystopia, it's more important than ever to look at that event with a cold eye toward the truth. And I can assure you, we will be doing just that. Unfortunately, false flags did not stop with 9/11. Indeed, we are now living in an era of them. The bombings, the shootings, the setup jobs on innocent people, and even the never-ending health scares, each designed in its own way to induce fear and to expand control over citizens. First, it's important to understand that false flags are a form of propaganda. After all, propaganda is nothing more than a language of deception and manipulation in order to persuade people to support a particular position. There are many levels of propaganda in our world, from the basic forms of cultural conditioning you get in school, to the incessant cultural distractions that tell you to look over here at the next shiny new trinket, to the news media that's owned by a very few massive corporations that select and spin information in extremely self-serving ways by which they omit nearly all the genuinely important news developments of our world.
Several people have been killed.
The men murdered that soldier.
Trying to drive a class warfare.
Bomb crews worked outside looking for explosives.
Indeed, those first few levels of propaganda, cultural conditioning, cultural distractions, and news media control, easily account for most of the mind manipulation that allows powerful elites to get their way. The system works extremely well, especially when most of the population is overworked, overmedicated, eating bad food. Bombarding people with sex scandals and sports while tossing in meaningless political platitudes usually works really well at keeping people off their game. Even so, every once in a while, stronger medicine is needed for elites to get what they want. That's when they might use covert ops, regime change tactics, and, yes, false flags. Let's talk about psyops. You might be interested to know that countries worldwide recognize false flags as part of a new form of warfare, hybrid warfare, essentially full-spectrum warfare. Hybrid warfare uses the conventional warfare tactics of armies and navies and air forces, but it also adds something more, what it calls irregular warfare. And this can include almost anything you can think of: cyber warfare, media propaganda, terrorist actions, and all kinds of clandestine, secret activities so that you don't know exactly who was behind an action. And if you don't know who did it, you can't really fight back. We're really talking about a revolution in how to wage war, and it's going on right under our noses. It's interesting that when a country or its military talks about hybrid warfare, it's always talking about something that the other guy does. One key element of hybrid warfare is psychological operations, or PSYOPs. Nowadays, the military calls it by a different name: Military Information Support Operations, or MISO. But the mission's still the same. In their words, to selectively convey information to influence minds, emotions, and what they call the objective reasoning of targets. In other words, influencing populations through propaganda, spin, and deception. The military and intelligence community practice three kinds of psyops: white, gray, and black. White psyops are straightforward. These are openly acknowledged statements or actions of the government, or at least are attributed to a source associated closely with that government. They would reflect an official viewpoint, like a statement by the president or a government official. That doesn't mean that they're truthful, by the way. After all, presidents can be pretty good at lying. Gray psyops are a bit more interesting. These are statements or actions in which the source is, quote, deliberately ambiguous. In other words, even though the true source would be the government, you wouldn't know that. A classic example of this is government collusion with mainstream media, in which the media spins and misleads, posing as objective journalism when in fact they're working directly for the government. The best known historical example of gray psyops was Operation Mockingbird.
Do you have any people being paid by the CIA who are contributing to the national news services, AP and UPI?
Well, again, I think we're getting into the kind of detail, Mr. Chairman, that I'd prefer to handle in executive session.
This ran from the 1940s through the 1970s and involved the secret collaboration of hundreds of American journalists with the CIA. This might involve journalists conducting espionage for the CIA while in a foreign country. It might involve planting false stories. It might involve controlling editorial policy. Ask yourself what you could do with hundreds of mainstream journalists secretly on your payroll. Mockingbird was manipulative enough. Today, things are far more sophisticated. There are countless whistleblowers, leaks, and investigations that make it clear what passes for mainstream journalism today is little more than the propaganda machine for the national security state. We'll be coming back to that sad reality later in the program. And then there are black psyops. Now things get really interesting. Back in 1954, the CIA defined black psyops as something perpetrated that appeared to emanate from a source hostile in nature. The US government would deny any connection. The policy statement went on to say that, quote, the content may be partially or completely fabricated, but that which is fabricated is made to appear credible. That, my friends, is a false flag, perpetrating something that you blame on your enemy. Now, that statement might be from 1954, but today, in the 21st century, the U.S. Army Psychological Operations Manual uses the exact same definitions of white, gray, and black psyops that the CIA was using in the 1950s, and the very same words. In other words, false flags are in the official playbook of the U.S. military and intelligence community.
Persuade, change, influence. That is the motto of the U.S. Army's Psychological Operations Regiment. They employ specific communication methods using a variety of techniques, technology, and mediums to develop and deliver messages which will have the greatest impact and influence. These methods often incorporate the use of state-of-the-art multimedia products that convey U.S. policy and national objectives.
What other countries sanction as acceptable operations is not as easy for us to document, but there are enough indications that it's going on in all leading nations. Something to keep in mind next time you're debating politics at a family reunion. Now what I want to do is to give you some tools to identify false flags. It's not that every false flag has all the following qualities, but they usually have many of them. In a sense, then, we can create a kind of false flag profile. Number one, it's a spectacular and emotional event. Now, this sounds like a hard and fast rule, but let's just leave it at it's usually a spectacular and emotional event. The main thing is that the target audience needs to be affected by the event, and the target audience is often the general population. For all practical purposes, it's a good rule. By spectacular and emotional, I usually mean traumatic in some way. We're talking major act of violence, but not any kind of violence. Something unusual, that seems designed to attract attention. It's not true, of course, that every violent, sensational act is a false flag. That's why we have other items on the checklist, such as number 2, instant media saturation.
The one I saw was dressed in black. He seemed very young.
Là, on a vu moi j'ai vu deux jeunes, pas plus de 25 ans, avec des kalachnikovs.
Just like item number 1, this doesn't mean automatically that we're talking false flag. However, when combined with number 1, that is, when we have a spectacular, traumatic event followed by instant, comprehensive media coverage, then we need to start paying close attention to what's happening. Regarding media coverage, it's helpful to distinguish between powerful state-sponsored or state-friendly media compared with smaller independent sources. In other words, when we find the major media organizations all covering the event in the same way right out of the gate in a manner that is clearly friendly to state interests, we need to sit up and pay close attention. If you look carefully, you will sometimes find local or independent news sources that have different information, sometimes critically important information that's different. This will only happen in the immediate aftermath of the event. In the case of a genuine false flag, this happens because they aren't in the club, so to speak, and they're not in on the fix. We should also note that the major media outlets will often be out in front of government action, that is, proposing, or at least opening the door for the very measures that the government apparatus will soon be proposing, typically either new restrictive laws or military action. And that leads us to item number 3. The case is quickly closed.
Sources are telling CNN that there are, quote, good indications that people with links to the Osama bin Laden organization are responsible for today's attacks.
Once this happens, we really need to be suspicious. Because in real life, investigations are messy. They can be filled with false leads and rabbit holes that don't go anywhere. But in the case of a false flag, this doesn't happen. Instead, within days, sometimes one day, think of 9/11 or Lee Harvey Oswald, the official verdict has been rendered, and apparently there's no need to continue an investigation. We're already informed by authorities that we know who committed the crime. In all cases where a false flag has been perpetrated, the major media outlets will refuse to question the authorities, will refuse to question the official narrative. Then item number 4. Item number 4 of a false flag is having a convenient scapegoat.
Es ist eine kleine, wurzellose internationale Clique, die die Völker gegeneinander hetzt, die nicht will, dass sie zur Ruhe kommen. Es sind die einzigen, die wirklich als internationale Elemente anzusprechen sind, weil sie überall ihre Geschäfte betätigen können.
Often the individual or group identified with the attack are well chosen and useful for immediate political purposes. Whether we're talking about the Nazis using Poles or communists in their false flags, Stalin using fictitious reactionaries during the purge of the 1930s, or the use of white supremacists and Muslims more recently, the false flag will use a patsy or a scapegoat that's identified with a group or a nation currently being demonized. This will then directly lead to item number 5, decisive and negative government action. And of course, that's the whole point of the business.
Terrorism and serious crime are a tiny subset of the possibilities that you could use this information for.
Such an action, always supported by a compliant media machine, will inevitably lead to one of 2 things, and sometimes both at the same time. First, an erosion of citizen rights in one form or another. This is nearly always done in the name of safety and protection, but it inevitably leads to greater police powers or other forms of regulatory power by the state. And then secondly, the false flag, especially if it's done internationally, can lead to an invasion of another country that could not ever otherwise be justified. And this has happened quite a few times. And if not an invasion, something perhaps even more popular, regime change. That creating a fake revolution to switch out an undesirable government has perhaps become more preferred than old-fashioned invasion or even military coup. Giving the pretense of democratic uprising always has its advantages. In our time, the goal of most false flags come down to 3 results: stripping away more rights, invasion, and regime change. A good investigator can usually determine if any of these were in the works, or at least actively desired before the false flag took place. And if so, we might just find some leading suspects. Then there's item number 6, important anomalies and questions. And this one is key.
The latest building collapse in New York, you might have heard a few moments ago, was talking about the Salomon Brothers building collapsing. And indeed it has. It seems that this was not a result of a new attack. It was because the building had been weakened.
As you can see behind me, the Trade Center appears to be still burning, completely disappeared now, and New York is still unable to take on board what has happened to them today.
A false flag, no matter how well pulled off, will usually leave behind clues to a smart investigator. When there are serious discrepancies raised in the aftermath of a shocking event that instantly spurs dramatic government action, we need to ask a logical question. Was the government itself guilty of the act it supposedly is protecting us from? Besides, the thing is, no matter how good the false flag profile may look, it doesn't mean very much until resourceful investigators get their hands dirty and investigate. Simple as that. There's always one other fundamental question we need to be asking about dramatic events that make the headlines, and that is item number 7, who benefits?
Dick Cheney said it would be a bad idea, and that's why the first Bush didn't go into Baghdad. Dick Cheney then goes to work for Halliburton, makes hundreds of millions of dollars, their CEO. Next thing you know, he's back in government. It's a good idea to go into Iraq.
He goes on to point out that 9/11 offered an easily exploited opportunity for Cheney to help mastermind an Iraq invasion and make a pile of cash.
Basic questions we must always be asking ourselves. Does this alleged terrorist action, or whatever it is, give a clear benefit to any government, any corporation, or financial institution? We need to look behind the headlines and what we are clearly being pressured to think. If there's a major beneficiary, we need to be aware of it. Throughout our history, there have always been a privileged few, but not like today. Today, a very tiny group of people and their corporations are looking to own all the water, all the minerals, all the natural resources, all the genetically modified foods, all the public services that were formerly administered by governments. They are moving to take all of it and manage these for their profit. Today, the 8 wealthiest people in the world have as much money as the poorest half of the entire human race. 8 people owning as much wealth as nearly 4 billion people. It's really not that complicated. When so few people and their corporations are moving so far ahead of the rest of us in terms of ownership of everything worth owning, they will do everything possible to keep us out of the way while they do it. They will influence governments around the world, especially the most powerful. They will ensure the passage of corporate-friendly laws that will cement their position forever. And they will definitely control the television news and entertainment system, making sure that whatever messages come through the channels of your TV or your local newspaper are friendly to their interests. But if these people are going to take everything worth taking in this world, they can't simply tell you what they're up to. After all, you and I might have something to say about that. So they must rule by deception, by confusion, by spin and propaganda. The truth is, there usually is a benefit to certain interests when these things occur, and it's not anti-government to ask questions about it. Indeed, it's the mark of someone who still has the ability to think independently, perhaps the most important, and during certain periods in history, the most dangerous quality we might have. Those are the big 7 items of a false flag, and as we move through this series, we'll be looking at the events under review through this lens. But I want to point out that this is not quite the same as a formula. There are patterns to look for, but we need to remind ourselves that this phenomenon is ever-changing. In the modern era of false flags, for instance, there are other developments to look for. The existence of multiple drills going on during the day of the false flag, drills that actually mimic the event that occurs. There's also a not uncommon connection of suspects to intelligence organizations like the CIA or FBI in America and their equivalent agencies in other countries, for instance. Then there is the proliferation of slogans, often immediately appearing as if they were cooked up in a Madison Avenue boardroom. Overall, we see increasing levels of sophistication in 21st century false flags, including a seamless integration with mainstream websites, search engines, and even cooperation with so-called alternative websites that maybe aren't so alternative after all. This is the nature of the new form of false flag. Highly covert, highly sophisticated, very, very difficult, if not impossible, to trace. But false flags can be even more slippery than this. Let me ask you, can a health scare be a false flag? Or let me put it another way. Let's look at a few fundamental realities. Big Pharma rakes in billions of dollars every year selling us drugs. That's what they do. They sell us drugs. Sure. They will gladly tell you that they're saving lives and making people happier, and they have expensive marketing teams and advertising teams and doctors and lawyers and legislators and judges in their pocket to back them up. So when a new virus comes along, which happens all the time, every day, including new strains of the influenza virus, the flu, is it exactly a false flag when the next new health scare hysteria comes our way? Because this happens to us every single year. Yes, we have flus every year and people die from them. But is that why we get these annual insertions of hysteria? All of those who make billions on their vaccines, and forgetting for the moment that they need you to be sick, to what extent is each new flu that appears little more than fear-mongering hype? Why worry about oregano oil, olive leaf, ginger, probiotics, honey lemon tea, vitamins, and good hygiene when you or your insurance provider can drop more money into the coffers of Big Pharma? There's no doubt that we are being played. But are these flu scares false flags? Well, let's call it a gray area. There are health scares that I think qualify absolutely as false flags. There are a few things to look for. Like any other false flag, you want to look for instant coordinated media attention to kickstart what's basically a health scare marketing campaign. Now that's pretty common these days since our news media is totally coordinated. But look for evidence of what the disease actually does, rather than the hype. In other words, is it actually deadly? Or has it been around forever and actually gives fairly mild flu-like symptoms, which you can treat with honey, lemon, and ginger? Remember the swine flu, otherwise known as H1N1, that hit the scene in 2009. The media blitz on it was unbelievable. People were truly in mortal terror. By the spring of '09, there was a near global panic.
Next, I would like to tell you about medicines that can be used to treat swine flu. CDC recommends the use of oseltamivir or zanamivir for the treatment and alternatively the prevention of infection with these swine flu viruses.
Later, a prominent German physician and healthcare official named Wolfgang Wodarg stated publicly that major firms had organized a campaign of panic to put pressure on the World Health Organization to declare a false pandemic to sell vaccines.
To discuss this, we're now joined live by Dr. Wolfgang Wodarg, who initiated this probe. Dr. Wodarg, you state that drug firms organized a campaign of panic over pandemic fears when one was not really evident. What made you come to this conclusion?
We didn't judge like this, but I think we see the necessity that we have to do some investigations in the Council of Europe to reinstall the trust and the reliability of such very important organizations like the WHO. And I think we have seen that there are many signs that there is a close cooperation between pharmaceutical companies and the WHO.
He said this campaign began in May 2009 in Mexico City when 100 or so normal flu cases were declared to be the beginning of a new pandemic. In fact, he said there was little scientific evidence for this. Even so, the WHO, working with Big Pharma, redefined pandemic to get what they wanted. They removed the statement that, quote, an enormous amount of people have contracted the illness or died, end quote, from its definition, and replaced it by stating simply that there has to be a virus spreading beyond borders and to which people have no immunity. I'll just say to you that personally I was skeptical the whole time of H1N1 and never did get a vaccination for it. Turns out that swine flu is still with us, by the way. WebMD tells us that after sweeping the globe, it's still a danger. You just don't hear much about it because, by and large, if you get it, you get a little sick for a little while, then you get over it. As I see it, there are two aspects of false flags that make it especially hard for most people to challenge them. First is the emotional trauma that these events inflict on us. A big part of the power of the false flag is that these traumatic events become joined early on to our intellect. That is, something awful happens, but then here comes the explanation. From that point on, most of us become emotionally bonded to the explanation itself. It's a very clever and very manipulative form of conditioning, and it works. We become resistant to challenging narratives that we ourselves have become emotionally affected by. Overcoming that is the first and hardest and most important step in identifying false flags. Beyond that, however, is the rest of society. In other words, once we ourselves take the red pill of truth, how do we navigate our way through society when, as far as we can tell, most people have still accepted the official narrative, in which most of us, after all, fear social condemnation? Throughout history, people have lost their jobs and worse for believing the wrong things, and that includes today in our country. There's a tremendous amount of social pressure exerted on all of us to believe certain things. We should not underestimate that. But look at it this way. That can be said about every single transformative belief that human beings have ever held. Visionaries throughout history have faced opposition for their insights. It's nothing new. And we today are indebted to those brave people of the past who have opened doors for us. I think a proper study of false flags helps us moving forward in many ways, but one important way is in teaching us how to evaluate information. We learn to be active in the process of learning, not passive recipients. We learn that digging deeper pays benefits to us, enabling us to look at the world around us with greater maturity and a deeper perspective. Our job as citizens of the world is not to allow governments to have us live in fear. Our job is to see the world clearly without illusion, beyond the propaganda and beyond the trauma. Through awareness, we are empowered. Through honest exploration, we can see through the fear-mongering narrative we're exposed to daily. We've all heard many times that the truth shall set us free. After all, how can we be free if we are shackled to lies and deception? So, my friends, remember, reaching the truth means stripping away the illusions around us. Don't buy into the fear. It's about waking up. I'm Richard Dolan.